And it's a pleasure being with everyone today to talk about this very important topic. This is something that I think we all are learning more about. It's something that's starting back in 2016. We really didn't even think that there was such an issue. We then have now learned that, unfortunately, we do have to deal with research security, even in fundamental and basic research. Well, let me start by telling you a little bit about the National Science Foundation. We're an independent US government federal agency, meaning we report directly to the White House, and we support all areas of basic research and education. We do this mainly using the grant mechanism, meaning we provide funding out to researchers through their research institution in the form of grants, usually 3 to 4 year grants. And the amounts range anywhere from $20,000 to millions of dollars. And more than 10% of our budget goes to major research infrastructure. We pride ourselves in having a very low overhead, meaning about 93% of our budget goes out the door in research funding. That also means, however, that we have a very small staff to deal with issues such as oversight and research security. And we're structured in a discipline-based way. I was talking to the other speakers about universities and the start of the university year again. And NSF is structured very much like a university with the different disciplines in directorates that very much mirror colleges and departments. We also use rotators quite a bit from universities who come into NSF as program managers, and they're subject matter experts in their field, and this keeps us very close to the science. We support the majority of US research in the academic sector in many areas. 87% of the computer science research in the US, 68% of the mathematics. And you can see that it is one of the largest funding agencies in the United States. Our budget is much lower than the National Institutes of Health, but we do have, and we're very proud of our healthy budget. And we're pleased at the potential that this budget may increase greatly, given the authorization that we just got in legislation in a bill called CHIPS and Science. CHIPS and Science also has many research security provisions that I'll touch upon as well. Our funding rate, however, is quite low, even given our healthy budget. So we're only able to fund 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 awards, depending on the subject area. And this is not due to the lack of quality of proposals we receive. It's much more to do with the budget and the fact that we get many more proposals than we can fund. This is important as well because when someone proposes to NSF and they do so using dishonest information or inaccurate information or incomplete, then it's unfair. It's unfair to all of those who honestly proposed to NSF, and we unfortunately could not fund them. So I'll start with a case study. And this was something where, unfortunately, we did have to take action as an agency. This is a senior researcher at a US-based institution with 4 awards that we unfortunately had to terminate. And this researcher had multiple undisclosed foreign affiliations. This is in violation of NSF's disclosure policies. And the NSF Office of Inspector General found these violations. Our OIG, as we call it, is the investigative arm and the auditing arm of the agency. It's actually independent from NSF, and many US government agencies have such an inspector general. And they're very, very busy these days, unfortunately, with these types of cases. Their caseload has increased about 500%. This particular researcher belonged to a scientific association that convened an independent panel based on accusations that came from other association members. And they found that the researcher also violated the association's peer review process by repeatedly sharing reviewer names and individual scores connected with paper submissions for the association's journal. and that the researcher coerced a co-author to proceed with submission of the manuscript to the association, despite concerns from the co-author about the accuracy of the results. The researcher was part of a foreign government talent recruitment program that was not disclosed to NSF. There were terms in the plan that could be linked to these issues. These plans, and I'll talk more about them, often compel the researcher to sign contracts with very troubling terms in them. The researcher has since resigned from the US university and has left the US. Something I did not write here, but that is very unfortunate, is one of the graduate students under this researcher, who happened to be from China, actually committed suicide, in part due to an investigation at the University of Florida, where the graduate student found the graduate student did not feel comfortable basically telling on their researcher and didn't know what to do. So this is the result, unfortunate result, that could occur with these cases, as well as, of course, threatening the integrity of the research itself through these affiliations that are not disclosed. Research security and research integrity are both extremely important, but they're different. And research security is the safeguarding of the research enterprise, and it's safeguarding against the behaviors that are aimed at misappropriating research and development. This is to the detriment of national and economic security, and it's also related to violations of research integrity. These are often caused by foreign government interference. Research integrity is adherence to professional values and principles. So this is the underlying of the research ecosystem itself. The principles such as objectivity, honesty, transparency, fairness, accountability, and stewardship. And this is in all areas of research: proposing, performing, evaluating, as well as for the funding agency overseeing research activities. I mentioned foreign interference, and it can be categorized as a foreign government entity's attempt to interfere with US research endeavors. Canada is seeing similar types of things, as are other countries that fund a great deal of research. Foreign interference does not equal international collaboration, and I'll talk in a little bit about how we can differentiate between foreign interference and international collaboration. And there are select foreign government talent recruitment programs that disregard intellectual property, and they do threaten these values of research integrity. These foreign government talent recruitment programs, some of them are above board, and their main effort is to recruit talent to that particular country, as long as it's transparent and fully disclosed, and the home institution of the researcher has approved such an association, there's technically nothing wrong with it. However, there are some of these programs that threaten the transparency, openness, and integrity of scientific research by directing or encouraging inappropriate behaviors. And they do this when these are employees of US or can be Canadian academic research organizations. So under certain programs, the university professor, again, full-time at a US or a Canadian university, is compelled to list their foreign university affiliation before their US university on publications. They're compelled to obtain large amounts of research funding for the foreign university, file a number of patents registered to the foreign university. They're often required to recruit a certain number of graduate students and junior researchers to join the program. And there are many other concerning aspects of these programs. Under the CHIPS and Science legislation, the malign foreign talent recruitment programs that have these concerning aspects to them are now prohibited if you're going to receive US federal research funding, and we're in the process of developing an implementation plan for that prohibition. In the US, we also have National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, NSPM 33. It was put into place in January of 2021, and we have an implementation plan that was put in place in January 2022. This crosses presidential administration, showing the importance, not due to politics, of these issues. And it does address why research security and integrity are important and outlines their key elements. It's very important to us to make sure we have clear roles and responsibilities within the US federal government related to research security. So it outlines these roles for both the security agencies as well as for the science agencies. And there are key requirements such as disclosure of key information and establishing a research security program in US research institutions receiving more than $50 million in federal funding. So we're in the process now of actually implementing the implementation guidance that was released in January 2022. The key parts of this are harmonization of disclosure policies among funding agencies in the US federal government so that we can receive information that we need to make sound funding decisions. It has clear terms about oversight and enforcement, and making sure that we as federal agencies have clear and appropriate policies, and that these policies are transparent about what the consequences are for violations. And it better establishes the key aspects of what needs to be part of research security programs at US research organizations that receive substantial federal R&D funding. The CHIPS and Science Act then further elaborates on this research security program requirements and the need to have research security training. And the US government, are funding training modules for the external community that I'll touch on as well. So again, CHIPS and Science, this legislation that was just passed, it prohibits malign foreign government talent recruitment programs. It also establishes a research security and integrity information sharing and analysis organization. That's a long name. We're calling it a risk assessment center that we're beginning to establish. And we know that Canada, the Canadian government, is looking to establish a similar type of entity, and we look forward to coordinating and sharing information. There's a research security training requirement. And this research security training also has to be part of the responsible and ethical conduct of research training for graduate students and postdocs. And there has to be additional reporting from US institutions on foreign financial transactions and gifts. And we're in the process of setting up that reporting system. These are the terms that I talked about that are in a malign foreign talent recruitment program definition in CHIPS and Science. Again, I mentioned some of these provisions. Other provisions include inability to terminate the contract, the overcapacity, overlap, and duplication and obligations, the fact that you have to omit, in some cases, acknowledgement of the US home institution, and that you cannot disclose the program participation. Not all of these arrangements have all of these clauses, and so we really need to be careful to have clear guidance to the research community on the prohibition, and that's what we're in the process of developing. To touch on disclosure briefly, it's extremely important, and this is something that is difficult because the research community wants to do its research, and we understand that. We do need the disclosure information because we need it to properly identify and assess risks, to make sure that we avoid conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment, and that we can properly assess the qualifications of the individual or the team. So we are in the process of harmonizing these disclosure requirements, and the proposed harmonized disclosure requirements are actually out for public comment right now. We'll collect those comments and then implement across the funding agencies these harmonized disclosure requirements. At NSF, we also want to make sure the disclosure requirements are as clear and understandable as possible. We also are in the process of using data analytics to understand the scale and scope of research security issues. And we look for non-disclosures of foreign affiliations and sources of funding, and then try to understand why these things were not disclosed to us. We do encourage international collaboration and distinguish it from improper foreign government interference. And we partner closely with the Office of Inspector General and the interagency community to address risks. This is an all of government and really all of research institution effort to try to address these issues. We did a report in 2019 through a group called the JASON, which is a group of US researchers who do work for the federal government in areas that intersect between science and national security. And we asked them about fundamental research security. They suggested to differentiate between international collaboration and foreign interference, that there might be a nice set of questions we can pose. And if we could answer these questions clearly, then it probably is a principled international collaboration rather than foreign interference. So we should be able to describe the engagement succinctly and without jargon. We need to make sure that if it is not fundamental research, we understand the institution's policies around creating it. Are the terms of the engagement made clear in writing? Is everybody identified? And are all the participants known? Are all the participants' conflicts of interest and commitment documented? Are there any aspects of the engagement that are not to be disclosed, and why? Is there any aspect of the engagement that seems unusual or poorly specified? Things should be clear in an international collaboration. Where does the funding and the other resources needed for the activity come from? They should be clearly identified, and it should be clear what each party is also providing. Are all the tangible assets of the engagement known, and how will they be shared? And who decides how they're going to be allocated? How does a participant end their engagement? Are scholars expected to reside away from their home institutions? And if so, how are they chosen to participate? What are the reporting requirements back to home institutions or organizations? And who will control the dissemination of the resulting fundamental research? These are all extremely important questions that we should be able to answer clearly. Lastly, I did want to mention this research security training that we're funding. This is a partnership among NSF, National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and the FBI. The awards are going to be made very, very shortly. We're going to fund 4 modules in research security, 1 overall on what research security is, 1 on assessing risks, 1 on international collaboration, and 1 on disclosure. It will take several months to develop these trainings, but then we will be able to make them freely and readily available. So they will be available, and you all will be welcome to access them as well. So there will be more to come on the platform where these will be available. And I will stop there, and I thank you very much for your time.
We've got a question from Terry Allen right off the hop. Terry, take it away.
We're used to thinking of science as being an international endeavor where we've got collegiality and cooperation and freely share information. But we've come to understand, of course, the fact that other countries will take advantage of that particular attitude. And so it's wonderful to see that we're incorporating we're thinking about this, incorporating some training courses and other things that you mentioned. One of the things that occurred to me is how does this overlap with the efforts of foreign governments to hack, for example, into scientific data, which are probably beyond the control of the individual laboratories. And the other thing that I have seen recently is that the Department of Defense has found that there were Chinese components in the some of the instrumentation, for example, in aircrafts and things. And so in lab equipment, how do we know that there aren't spy devices or other hacking components that are incorporated into the sophisticated instrumentation we use in the laboratories? And that seems to me it's maybe the other side of the coin of what you've been talking about.
Yes, you're exactly right. And this is something that we're struggling with as well. We want to maintain the openness of research, of course, because we know that the free dissemination of research results in innovation. It results in improving those results, being able to replicate them. At the same time, there are many cases, unfortunately, of hacks and other cybersecurity intrusions. We did another Jason study on cybersecurity at the major research facilities, and we find that it's even more challenging because, of course, the cybersecurity needs and the ways that a foreign government can hack vary very much on the type of facility, the type of lab, the type of information. And so a number of different more suitable measures, customized measures need to be put in place depending on all of those different aspects. So at NSF, we are going to be hiring a cybersecurity chief to deal with the major facilities and how to assist the major facilities with these efforts. At the same time, there is a requirement as part of the training that there has to be cybersecurity. We know that that's going to be so incredibly challenging. And so we're going to be needing to help our universities. I'm envisioning that through this risk assessment center that we're going to be establishing, that we're going to provide this type of cybersecurity assistance because, you know, these are universities and we're not equipped, and understandably so, to deal with these cybersecurity threats. So that will all be coming.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Terry, for that question. I was on mute myself. Appreciate the question and Rebecca's response. What's really struck me about this whole area, Rebecca, is the high level of dependence on, I would say, individual professional ethics and sort of some kind of disclosure and sunshine. And I think in your slides 15 and 16, that checklist of characteristics of research agreements or research collaborations that people should look for to indicate that they are indeed very legitimate and transparent and not in violation of any of the principles that you've enunciated today is extremely important. One of the things, and I think this came up when you spoke to the case, the unfortunate outcome of the case at the University of Florida, is there a whistleblower component to any of the strategies that you've identified where if people observe something that they can somehow safely and anonymously identify something that should be looked into?
Excellent question, and sorry about my dog, of course.
That's okay.
So yes, that is something else that I am planning to have as part of this risk assessment center, is for us to assist universities in developing some type of reporting process. I think this is similar in some ways to sexual harassment, where we know that in many labs, there's a power relationship. And if you look at the Lieber case at Harvard, he was the chair of the chemistry department at Harvard. And there were emails where he said to his graduate students, "Don't you say anything." And this is, and of course, they don't want to ruin their future. So we need to figure this out better. I was just talking about this with the national academies as well. And I think this is something that we need to do through the center. And I also am thinking about doing a study on this, on how we can better address the power relationship overall for clear communication on research security issues, sexual harassment issues, and other issues in the labs.
Mm-hmm. Right. That, I think that's very important because, as you say, the people who may see things that should be questioned or brought to someone's attention, it's almost like you need an ombudsman in each institution or at the NSF too, for whom someone can safely report something that they're not certain is compliant. I mean, it's really all of these other political factors, and as you say, hierarchy and power relationships in the university sector make it extremely complex in terms of ensuring compliance with doing the right thing. And there's a lot of, as you noted, sort of culture building that needs to be done at all levels to make sure that that professionalized culture is in fact something that people are aware of and should aspire to, and have everyone has the right to uphold that in whatever way they see fit. And so that the work you've done here is really fascinating. And it's one of those things that's hidden in plain sight in many respects. And
we find in many of these cases that there was one office or entity that might have received such disclosure information, but it wasn't taken over to the sponsored research office, or it wasn't taken to the conflicts official. And so somehow coordinating and making sure that the information is properly given to the appropriate offices and assessed appropriately is important. And then with the ombuds, of course, we also need to make sure that they know when they receive concerning information where they can go. Often in the US, universities are told to go to their local FBI field offices, and the FBI field offices are doing a wonderful job. But as you can imagine, there is a real level of discomfort of going to the FBI. So to me, if we can help with a more comfortable means through which to report, where often these are not issues of legality, but they're issues of ethics and integrity that we really do need to deal with.
So I will give you a bit of a perspective from somebody who actually got tasked with doing these risk assessments. And the reason I got tasked with doing these risk assessments, because I am not in the research office. I run the Partnerships and Innovation Office, which is the tech transfer office for our university, is that we had some experience with dealing with companies and finding information out about companies. And so this kind of fell to us by default, because we seemed to be the most qualified folks at the university to actually address this. And one thing I will say is, while I might seem to be the most qualified person to do this, I don't feel like the most qualified person to do this. And but I don't think there, at least until just today, actually, there wasn't anybody else to do this. So let me jump to the next slide. So as you're probably aware, back in 2021, Canada did announce this strategy around national security guidelines for research partnerships. The web link is there. It's largely involving self-identification of risks, which is an interesting approach. And I know that NSERC was the agency or the funding group that sort of started on this and identified that we needed to do risk assessments on any industry partners that were collaborating with our researchers. MyTax has taken a different approach, and we suspect that CIHR and SSHRC will follow along, with similar expectations around identifying research security risks. So initially, at least in Canada, the focus has been on collaborations with companies in that natural sciences space. And that's really where we have focused our efforts. But with an understanding of we know that we're going to have to do more than this going forward. So as Rebecca alluded to, the big risks that we're talking to, theft of information, interference in research, this movement of knowledge and results out of the country in an unethical way, and basically theft again of intellectual property, or claiming of ownership of intellectual property, or diminishing of ownership of Canadian intellectual property. So those are the big risks that we're talking about here. There are a number of acts and other things like that play into this. There's the Export and Import Permits Act, and we're all used to dealing with things that might involve players in countries that are on restricted lists, and like for example, we can't collaborate with folks in Iran very easily. As an example, that was one that came up the other week in my world. I had a researcher who's wanting to do some work there, had some contacts there, but wasn't able to do that because of some of those controls that are presently in place. There's also the Defense Production Act, or controlled goods, that comes into play. And then there's the Area Control List, which has a number of countries. And then, the United Nations has some Economic Measures Act. And we've seen this with Russia in particular, which I think for us was the real impetus to sort of take this more seriously, and do more than I was personally doing in terms of screening these companies. And that really prompted us to come up with a bit more of an internal approach, something that was consistent, that just didn't involve one country or one special situation, but that actually was going to be able to be more widely implemented and used as a tool to make sure that we were not going to run afoul of any of our funders' requirements, that we weren't going to be collaborating with folks, and also, of course, just to ensure the security of our research. So the risk areas, I won't go through all of these, but you can see if you look through this list, it's pretty broad, and it really is kind of all-encompassing. You could slide, in my mind, almost any type of research underneath any number of these categories, and so it's pretty clear that it's really broadly based, and it's not just about one or two things. That this is something that we need to take seriously, regardless of the area of research that's happening. In the federal government document, and I apologize that this is a little hard to read, but as I mentioned at the front end, it really starts with a very self-directed process. The researcher at the very top is expected to apply these security guidelines and do that risk assessment questionnaire, which has some of the questions that Rebecca addressed, and a couple of others, but it's not really very detailed. And then the institution is supposed to go in and assess that risk assessment questionnaire, look at it, modify it, where things are unclear, or yes, there is a potential security risk. The institution is then required to help the researcher develop a risk mitigation plan. And so this is all at the point of pre-grant application, and then the grant application gets submitted, including that risk assessment questionnaire and any mitigation plan that might have been developed, if that's appropriate. And then it reaches the funding agency, who then, of course, does their standard, is this good science? And then also looks at that, security risk piece and the mitigation plan. And then, at the bottom there, you've got that first real decision point, is that, are there risks identified? If no, it's just basically a standard scientific review. And if yes, or they're unsure, it proceeds to a scientific review. Again, if it doesn't pass that review, there's no funding. But then they may pull in additional advice or perspective on the national security risks of that research. And then there is at some point a decision around, are those acceptable risks or not? And then the funding is decided. So even if the science is really good, it could be rejected on a factor of unacceptable risk profile in terms of national security. So to try and make this a little more granular, I thought I would sort of walk through the process that we use. And just for example, last week I was asked to review a potential collaboration involving a large multinational engineering firm. I won't name the organization, but one of our researchers was wanting to do an insert collaboration with them. And the nature of the research, as I looked at it, was pretty standard type research, nothing that sort of had at least an overt security risk associated with it. It was looking primarily at infrastructure and roads type thing. And so, what do we do when we actually come across one of these? So the first thing that we do is look at, where is that organization based? If they're based in Canada, that risk is definitely lower. We also look at their ownership to see, are they owned by any entities that may have links to to bad actors or countries that might be complicated. We often look, or we do look at what kind of other projects are they involved in. And this particular project, like I said, this multinational, that multinational had lots of collaborations with the US government and the Department of Defense, which, in my mind, if they pass that muster, they probably are quite a low risk. And then we looked at their CEDAR filings and things like that, and looked at, what sort of corporate statements have they made around, being good corporate citizens and not being involved in that sort of thing. And then we also look at, do they have partners? Who else have they obviously collaborated with in the past that may be problematic? And one of the, and I'll get to the challenges later, but as you can see, one of the big challenges with this is rarely do you have complete information, in any of these spaces, because if somebody is truly going to be a bad actor, they're probably not going to advertise that they are a bad actor and sort of do a lot of press releases or things around that. So, we will look at the company's office to look at the ownership structure. If that makes sense, we will look if they're public, it's a little easier. If they're a private company, it's obviously quite challenging. We will look at press releases because sometimes that provides some guidance. And again, I'll use this engineering firm as an example. They had a press release that stated, particularly with the Russia situation, that they were committed to not collaborating with any Russian companies or organizations or folks who did business with Russia, and that if they did find somebody who was a collaborator, they would cease or end or terminate that collaboration with them. And again, I said, as I said, we looked through the CEDAR filings and other regulatory filings that might be available. But this is, obviously quite an incomplete set of information. We will obviously ask the researchers as well if they are aware of anything, but more often than not, I would say that they are not aware. They are not thinking about that sort of thing because they are interested in pursuing the science, moving the science forward, as opposed to thinking about what kind of company they are actually collaborating with. So what we have done is we looked for some other tools to start using to try and do a better job of looking at, are these companies risks? And we are looking primarily at companies that we are collaborating with. And the one we settled on was this by a group or it's called Caron. And it's, it's relatively simple to use. You basically type in the name of the company. And if you have an address or anything else like that, that can be helpful if there's companies that are named the same in various jurisdictions. But it basically spits you out a very graphical slide of who the company is and how it is connected to other organizations. They have a very large data set that they use. It's constantly updated, so that's good. And it's a really simple visual that you end up getting. And in terms of being able to see the connections between the organization you're collaborating with and folks who may be suppliers to them or be co-owners or subsidiaries or those sorts of things, that can be helpful. The cons, of course, are that this sort of software is quite expensive. I don't have the exact price on hand, but I believe for a single seat of this software, it was above $10,000 annually. And we really ended up requiring 2 seats of this to actually work for our institution. So it ends up being a significant expense. And the other thing is that, it tells you that, okay, so this company has a 5% ownership by, let's say, a Chinese company that has some military connections. So that's helpful. Or it's partly owned by somebody who's on a sanctions list, but is that sufficient enough to say, no, that research shouldn't continue? So it does require some interpretation. And so one of the other things that we have done, and I got an email about a minute before this webinar started, that our research security officer is now in place, has had some training, and the software is available to them. And so, my job here is going to be done, which I'm very happy for, because I never really felt comfortable, providing a firm answer that this was not a risk. We have not at this point encountered a situation where the collaboration didn't proceed because there was a perceptual risk. But so I'm very happy that now this is somebody else's problem instead of mine. But we'll see how this goes going forward. So this is the sort of type of information you get from this Charon software. You type in, and we'll just use this circled thing in the middle there. That's the company that you're looking for. You'll see that there is an individual, and they're usually named, who's an owner, and they might be a director also of a sanctioned entity. Or it could be that the sanctioned entity was actually, a part owner or a complete owner or whatever of the organization that you're looking for. Or they might be a vendor or some other have some sort of other relationship with a military group that may be in a country that's challenging or problematic. But again, as you look at these, you sort of go, well, at what percent ownership is sufficient enough by a sanctioned entity to cause you problems? And I think we've decided if there's anything at all, then we have to have a deeper discussion, is basically what that amounts to. But if there's no sanctioned relationships at all that show up here, where it's considered that we can go forward with it. But as I said, we're just starting to use this software, and I think it'll be very helpful. But it is definitely not complete information, because as any database is only as good as the data in. And I think the folks at Charon are really quite good. There's a lot of FBI and CIA type folks and NSA type folks out of the US who are responsible for collecting and entering the data. So I think as we looked at this, we had a lot of confidence. We also liked this particular software because it was the one that was selected by NSERC and a few other institutions that sort of gave us some comfort that we weren't doing this all on our own. And we would have a network of folks in order to deal with. There was another software that we did look at that was, instead of looking at the ownership structure, was primarily looking at press releases and other public data. And we decided that, that ownership piece and that connection between the businesses was probably more relevant than stuff that you might read in a press release, because again, folks who are going to be bad actors aren't probably going to put out press releases saying that, hey, we're involved in a company. So, the outstanding questions for me, at least, as somebody who did not feel qualified in order to do this, what if we're wrong? And what if we're wrong in both directions? I mean, what if we would stop some research that really wasn't a security risk, or what if we missed one that was a security risk? That was a huge concern. Who's going to pay for this? We've now hired a person, so we have a full-time salary that we've covered, plus 20,000 plus in annual software costs. So this is not a trivial type of expense. And then, what if somebody like CSIS, for example, has information on a potential partner that's not in the database, and we're trying to do a collaboration with them, will they tell us? How will they tell us? I've had very limited interactions with CSIS. They are frankly a little cloak and dagger, and so it's difficult to get good information from them. It's not like you can simply call them up and say, hey, is this company a risk? And again, we want to be very clear that we are not running afoul of our, especially the Tri-Council and other, granting agencies requirements for doing due diligence, but those agencies have not been crystal clear on how much due diligence is enough in order to say that we've done an adequate job of screening the companies that we might partner with. And then we also had a quite an intense and long discussion around who do we have to screen. So collaborators, yes. Because we're a public institution, should we screen our vendors, the contractors we use? Do we need to screen our staff to see if they are in any, and potentially even students? And so the decision was made that our purchasing office would also put all the vendors through this system to make sure that we as an institution, we're not putting ourselves at risk by dealing with vendors who may be on sanctions lists or who may be controlled, at least in part, by companies on sanctions lists. And then how often do we need to screen? The sanctions lists are definitely not static. In talking to the folks who provide the software, new names and organizations are added to the sanctions list almost weekly. And so how often do we need to screen? And I think that is still very much an open question. And, as you can imagine, the resource there is quite intense to be able to do this. And there is some ability to batch these sorts of things, right? We could take our vendor list, give it to the folks with the software, and they can basically, hey, there's nobody on a sanctions list that's associated with these 5,000 vendors. But these other ones need a closer look to see if there's anything, right? Because there was something that got flagged there. So that's a big question, and has a pretty significant financial implication as well. And then, as we think about where do we move forward here, we know that we're starting with NSERC, and we need to move to other fields going forward. We're also going to start including licensing transactions, which my office works with in those assessments, because we don't want to be seen as licensing a technology to a bad actor. And then we also recognize that we have to build this expertise at our institution, around the whole area of risk assessment. And we do have a risk office, but this is a whole nother level. They did not feel comfortable with their current expertise at doing these assessments either. So we do know that this is a skill set that we have to build up, and we are early days in that process. And we will see exactly where this goes going forward. So I think I'm going to stop there, and happy to ask any questions or answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Darren. And it's my pleasure to open it up to questions now for Darren. Does anyone have anything specific that they'd like to ask? Marshall, is there anything in the chat?
We have Terry Allen has raised her hand again, so please go
All
ahead.
right. Yeah, unmute yourself, Terry, and proceed.
Yeah, I find myself rather torn by these discussions. In case it was mentioned already, but I'm the chair of the Research Management Committee at NMIN. But I've had over 50 years, over half a century of experience in the research field. And what I'm seeing is amongst these major trends that are going on is that when we started out, we were doing basically curiosity-driven research, basic research, and we had very little thoughts about any of these particular issues. And as my research developed, I had developed relationships with the Soviet Union and Iran and China and India and South Africa and, you name it. And and we became, the pressure on us was to become more and more commercialized, which brought in all of a sudden all of these new issues that we never had to think about before. And so the pressure to translate research, commercialize and license it out and start dealing with companies has been what's leading to a lot of these new security concerns and whatnot. And I know the horse has left the barn on that, and we're not going to be going back. But here's what I still am concerned about in meeting people from all of these many different countries and students. First of all, we have fewer and fewer Canadian trained postgraduates and postdoctoral students and graduate students. And we're relying more and more on students coming and postdocs coming from foreign countries. So we have less control over that because our homegrown product isn't meeting our homegrown needs and demands. And the second thing is that when I talk to a lot of these young people and early career people in foreign countries, by tightening it up, we're having material effects on their ability to have careers in the science, in the sciences. And they're increasingly frustrated that they're being locked out of where they see that the big research and is happening. And so I feel very sorry for them, and I have to tell them, it's something that we have no control over, but we can't let them into our country, or I can't let them into my lab, and they may be perfectly innocent and perfectly wonderful people, and yet they're getting caught up in this whole new development of our concerns about commercialization and security. And I could go on, but I'm not going to go on. I'll stop there. I think you have an understanding of what I'm thinking and what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, I hear those concerns. You know, when Rebecca and I gave this presentation, or gave a similar presentation in February and autumn, we actually had an FBI agent who was on the panel with us. And he actually, I thought, had some really great insights, because, you know, these foreign bad actors have been, you know, basically stealing research out of Western countries for quite some period of time, and trying to influence them, you know, to so that they could become more successful, and, you know, our countries become less successful. So this is not new, and I think, you know, with the increase in globalization, it's only become more prominent and more visible. And so, you know, now there are steps being taken to try and slow this down or stop this. So, but I don't think it's new. You know, I think there's been a lot of countries who send their folks to the Canada or the US to get trained, in hopes that they bring that knowledge back to their home country, and, you know, create benefit for their home country. And I think we do that as well, right? I mean, we send grad students to Europe and all over the world, so that they can get training and come back and benefit Canada. I mean, that's just part of what that is. But you want to do that in an ethical way, as opposed to a non-ethical way. And I think that's where it comes to. But you know, I think this is not something that I ever thought that I was going to have to deal with when I started my job, you know, in terms of commercialization. But here it is. And so I don't know that it's as simple as blaming commercialization. That may be a part of it, but you know, it's definitely it's been happening, and we are aware of it, and we want to you know, ensure that you know, we maintain our countries in the form that we would like them to be, rightly or wrongly.
Thank you, Darren. Are there any other questions or comments, either for Darren or Rebecca at this time?
I see no raised hands, and there's no written.
I can just weigh in. And
Perfect. Well, I'm going to
sure.
jump. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Sorry. So just to weigh in and echo Darren's comments in response to Terry's comments and question. I think the other challenges we have are we can't put the horse back in the barn, of course, and technology is developing a lot more rapidly than it has in the past. So these issues become even more important. The other big factor is that we do have other governments, authoritarian governments, who have very explicitly said that they feel that their path to power is through not only commercialized research, but also fundamental research and basic research. And again, there's nothing wrong with that in theory. It's how they then obtain that knowledge. And they're using methods to obtain that knowledge in very systematic, organized ways. We do have to deal with them. At the same time, I share the concern about graduate students and others from other countries who might be caught up in this whole maelstrom. And it's something that certainly we have to maintain an open, welcome environment to a point. But it is this unfortunate world that we live in, where we do have to have, in addition to that, additional controls. And universities are being expected to do things that I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, but things that I don't think they would have been asked to do years ago. It would have been something that,
Very true.
yeah, the State Department, Homeland Security in the US would have been expected to do, but there are a lot more expectations on universities.
Mm-hmm. Marshall, any other questions on your side?
Diana, would
Seeing
you?
none, hearing
Would,
none. I'm going to
how,
jump.
how does NMIN feel about this? And Diana, maybe you could just say a few words about that.
Well, thank you, Terry. You must have been reading my mind, because I was going to comment how important this issue is to the field of nanomedicine research. In Canada, we have some of the world leaders, and they collaborate with world leaders in the US in this field. And some of the vaccines that were created for the COVID pandemic were commercialized and issued globally to save millions and millions of lives around the world in the last 2 years. And on that note, I think this issue, it should be of great importance to the students in our network. It illustrates the, I always tell people to embrace the uncertainty. There's such an enormous opportunity here for new jobs and new roles in the knowledge economy, which we're going to require people with nanomedicine's expertise. So that's a shout out to our trainees that this is something that is really important, and it's an emerging new challenge. Not that espionage has not been going on since time immemorial, it has, but now the importance of intellectual property and the development of new technologies for economic growth and in countries and for the health and safety of people around the world, I don't think it's ever been recognized as so important as it has right now. The other thing that I'm going to observe out of the discussion today, which was really incredibly insightful and illuminating for me, is the degree to which there's so many moral hazards embedded in this whole process. The degree to which checklists are developed to say, check on these things, these 12 characteristics need to be attached to a project that gets passed through as acceptable, only provides a checklist of things to subvert or get around or not disclose or hide, cover up. It's just one of those things that it's going to be every minute of the day, you're going to have to be one step ahead. And I think that's why it requires everyone to understand how important this is and to look for the symptoms of things that may not meet the test of ethical research collaborations. I think everyone needs to take responsibility for this in whatever role you play in the research enterprise and in Canada or the US. And I would like to ask, knowing how, I harken back to Rebecca's earliest comments, that 93% of our funding goes into research, and we have a very small admin team. And we're the same way because no one likes to fund administration. And Darren, I know you fight that battle on a daily basis just to get staff for your UILO office. So where is the money coming from for these new people and this expertise at the university level? Because at one level, who's going to own the problem? If we all need to own the problem, it runs the risk of nobody paying for the problem solution. So Rebecca and Darren, where does the money come from right at the interface of the IP development and what we call it theft or misappropriation? Who's going to pay for these security professionals? Where does that budget, or where should it come from?
So this is something that is the big issue on the table, especially for smaller universities and institutions that definitely might not have the resources to pay for this. And other governments know they don't have the resources to pay for it, and so they then become targets themselves, the smaller universities. And so at NSF, we're thinking about ways that we can assist. We have a new program called Granted, which is really focused on helping with the proposal process for smaller and emerging research institutions and help with that infrastructure. And I'm thinking about trying to insert into this Granted program some efforts related to helping with research security efforts as well. And, because I think that we as the government do need to help. This is a huge burden. Increasing even the disclosure is huge, and we know it is. Reporting is huge. So we do need to assist. Now, whether Congress is going to agree with me and actually give us the funding to do this is another question, but that's my proposal on the table.
Excellent, thank you. Darren.
And I think in Canada, I mean, there was a line in the last federal budget that did allocate some funds for research security. I think we're still waiting to see exactly how those play out and what sort of strings come with those funds. But I think the federal government has, at least agreed to step up to a certain extent, in terms of helping. Will it be sufficient given the actual costs of doing this? I think that question is still open, and what will be the constraints that come with that funding, or additional expectations that come with that funding, might be as challenging as the funding itself, as receiving the funding.
Exactly. Certainly, to have identified the problem is step one, and to have put in place a lot of the guidelines and the practices and use of databases and things like that is certainly an important next step. There's clearly going to be a lot more work that needs to be done before this issue gets wrangled down to the ground. But and as I said, I think it's going to be one of those things where it's an ongoing multi-level of government, multi-institutional effort to really not only just create awareness and understanding of the risks, but the identification of the symptoms of the high-risk behaviors or activities. It's something I think just making increasing awareness of this is a really important first step. Are there any further questions, comments, or observation? Terry, any final comments from you as our chair of Research Management Committee?
I just think that there's a balance here, and it's important to get the balance right. There's a balance on the side of increase the security, and there are things to be gained from that and gained from the commercialization. But there are also losses in terms of collegiality and international cooperation and free exchange of science and things like that. And so I think we want to make sure that we don't lose more than we gain.
Those are words of wisdom to guide our efforts in this area in the future. Thank you so much, Terry.